Okay, good evening, everybody. It's 8 o'clock. We're just going to wait another couple minutes to give people a chance to log in. So hang tight. We'll be starting in just a couple moments. Okay, so again, if you've just joined us, just waiting on a minute or two before we get the program going. Thanks for joining us tonight, and looking forward to our time together with Liel Leibovitz. Okay, everybody. Good evening. We're just going to start in one more minute. We're so excited to welcome our guest speaker tonight, Liel Leibovitz. And so in just about a minute, we're going to turn the program first over to Rabbi Morgenstern, who's going to introduce our guest speaker for tonight and introduce this series. So just hang tight, and we're going to get started in about 30 seconds.
Okay, good evening, everyone. All right, beautiful. We have a wonderful amount of people here. I want to welcome the members of Young Israel of Scarsdale, as well as the members of Young Israel of New Rochelle, who are joining us this evening. And God willing, for our whole series, this is co-sponsored by Young Israel of New Rochelle, Young Israel of Scarsdale, and the LTF, the Living Torah Fund, where we our goal is to perpetuate legacy through learning. It's a series on anti-Semitism in America and the emerging Jewish spirit. And the first of our presenters this evening is Liel Leibovitz. He's the senior writer for Tablet Magazine. He's a visiting professor at NYU, graduate of Columbia University, author of several books, and currently does a podcast called Unorthodox, and also does a podcast on the Daf Yomi, which I was a guest of this morning, which was really a fun experience. But more to it, something is going on in this country. We live in a world that is, probably the best way to put it. It's like post-Pittsburgh. And I think with the pandemic and with elections and everything that's happened, it kind of, puts it, down below in terms of what's really going on and what our priorities are and should be. But the reality is there's a changing landscape here in America, and it's our duty and our obligation to explore it and to be able to see it for what it is. And Liel is really one of the leading voices, not just in the country, but obviously things spread right in the world, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of speaking truth and allowing them to be heard, and not being cowed by those who might call those truths upsetting or disturbing, and he really makes, I know for me, for one, he makes me think. And when I see his articles, I'm a religious reader of his articles, and they change your perspective, and they really make you think about where we're at and where we need to be. So without further ado, I give you Liel Leibovitz. Welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi Morgenstern, for such a generous introduction, after which I'm afraid I'm bound to disappoint. What could ever meet this standard? Thank you also, Rabbi Klinker, and if I may extend a warm thank you to the person who made the shidduch, one of the congregation's finest, my colleague, friend, and producer of all these podcasts you mentioned, Sarah Fredman-Ader. I want to start today's talk. I believe there's sort of a bylaw in all fine print of all Jewish events that every talk begin with a Hasidic tale. And so I'm going to do my part and tell you one of my favorites. There once was a young yeshiva student in the Polish city of Krakow. And he was, to put it very mildly, not the brightest tool in the shed, not the sharpest tool in the shed, not the brightest student in the study hall. And as a result, he was having a little bit of a crisis of faith. He was starting to think that maybe this whole religion thing, this whole Judaism, this whole study, maybe it wasn't for him. And so one day he did something that was unthinkable to him previously. He sneaked out of the study hall and he bought, for a few zloty, he bought the local newspaper. And he's flipping through the newspaper, and there towards the back, he sees a column. And the byline reads simply, "The Great Atheist of Krakow." And the student was floored. He reads the column, and every word seems like fire. This person is bringing about arguments, saying that maybe God doesn't exist. How do we know? And he's talking about doubt. And he's talking about all these precepts and notions and concepts that our yeshiva boy has never heard in his life. And so, day after day, the yeshiva student sneaks out. He saves his zloties and he buys the newspaper. And every day, he turns to the back to read the column by the great atheist of Krakow. And every day, the atheist doesn't disappoint. Fiery words. Words to light the soul aflame. And so one day, after a few months, our student decides that it is time to meet his idol. And he collects all the money that he has, and he takes the train to the center of town, and he doesn't know where he's going or what he's about to do. He's completely lost. He grabs the first person he sees, and he shows the newspaper and says, do you know where I could find the great atheist of Krakow? Person says, look, I don't know from the great atheist of Krakow, but it stands to reason that if you'll find a person like this, it's probably in that neighborhood over there. So our guy walks and walks and walks and walks for about an hour, and he gets to the neighborhood finally, and he grabs the first person he sees, and he says, do you know I could find this person, this genius, this great person, the great atheist of Krakow? The person says, well, you're definitely in the right neighborhood. Try that street over there. So our student runs and runs and runs and runs and runs. And he gets to the street and he asks the first person he sees, do you know what I could find? Great atheist, Krakow. And the person says, yes, number 19, right over there. And our guy walks until he reaches number 19. And he looks up and his heart sinks. Because number 19 is the synagogue. He thinks to himself, has to be some kind of terrible mistake. It's inconceivable that the great atheist of Krakow would be in the synagogue, but, got nothing else to go on. That's what everybody says. Might as well give it a shot. So he walks into the synagogue and he says kind of in a very quiet voice, excuse me, do you know I could find the great atheist? And the yeshiva boichel there says, oh, of course, the great atheist is right over there in the Bet Midrash. Let's go to the study hall. You'll see him. And he walks into the study hall, and the only person there is the rabbi, the famous rabbi, big long beard, sitting there, wrapped in his talis, praying. Guy doesn't know what to do. He walks sort of very quietly, gingerly, said, Rabbi, I'm very sorry. I don't mean to waste any of your time, but, I've been told, and this is really awkward for me, but are you the person who writes these columns? Are you the great atheist of Krakow? And the rabbi says, yes, I am he. And the student said, oh Hashem, thank God I have come to the right place. I have so many questions for you. And the rabbi says, that's great. But before we even talk, I have some questions for you too. And the yeshiva student says, of course, ask away. Sit down, says the rabbi. And he starts quizzing the kid. Do you know about Rishonim? Do you know about Achronim? Do you know Rambam? Do you know Nachmanides? Do you know, have you read Talmud? Have you read Yerushalmi and Bavli? Do you really know stuff? And when he sees that the Talmid, when the student really doesn't know that much, he says to him, Boychik, you have a lot to learn before you could call yourself an atheist. I love this story because I think it captures a certain kind of wisdom that is particularly prevalent and relevant in times such as the ones that we find ourselves right now, as we all reflect on situations that appear to us to be sort of too confusing and too sort of historically out of sorts for our own sensibilities. And it seems to me that, like the student in the story, we have a lot of learning to do, a lot of reflection before we could declare that we understand our contemporary moment in time. So what are these really big questions that we are grappling with ourselves? It's the questions of trying to make sense of our fractured political scene, of trying to find out what's going on that makes so many of us feel like we are at a unique turning point in history, like this is the end of an era or the beginning of a new era. It is trying to make sense what happened not just this November, but for that matter, in 2016. Now, to hear our self-appointed intellectual and moral betters who write for formerly formidable publications like the New York Times tell it, there are sweeping, simple, fiery answers. If you're on the left, you're likely to hear people railing against deplorables, against racists, against people who rose one morning and decided that they had no regard for any values or virtues save for the satisfaction and relief of their own unbearable urges. If you're on the right, you're prone to hear people talking about socialists taking over, like it was, 1968 and the Red Scare, or 1958 and the Red Scare was at its height, and some orchestrated conspiracy to rid America of its freedoms was being orchestrated at the highest level of government. These explanations, I am very thrilled and deeply relieved to report, are deeply flawed. They serve much by way of inciting these kind of emotionally turbulent, tempestuous, tumultuous, ecstatic sensations that so many of us have become addicted to as we go to our phones first thing in the morning and go on our favorite websites or watch MSNBC or Fox News or whatever our choice of kind of media drug may be. But they do very little to explain all sorts of strange phenomena that we're seeing, like why, for example, to name just a few, did Donald Trump succeed in either taking over or nearly taking over Texas border towns on the border of Mexico that you would think, if you had been paying any attention to reporting in our mainstream publications for the past 4 years, would go overwhelmingly, as they have for decades, to the Democratic candidate. Or for that matter, why a not unsizable kind of minority of lifelong Republicans decided not just to abandon the Republican candidate at this turn in time, but enthusiastically turn over to the Democratic Party. Furthermore, you would not understand how time and again in 2020 as in 2016, the prognosticators whose job it is to sort of try to make sense of which way the wind blows have failed to deliver anything even remotely akin to an accurate or even a sort of moderately accurate picture of what's going on. Now, much of this confusion has to do, I admit, with the identity of the person at the eye of the storm, at least publicly. But Donald Trump blaming his unlikely rise on everything that you see only takes you so far, because Trump is not the disease. He is merely a symptom of a fractured political situation that we need desperately to understand if we are to advance to any place worth advancing to. And so what's going on? I would like to suggest that the divide that we're seeing is not between Republicans and Democrats. It is not between the left and the right. It is not between secular and religious Americans. It is not between people in the heartland and people on the coast, though all of those may certainly be useful indicators. I think what we're seeing is a larger rift between what the British writer and sociologist, the unimprovably named David Goodhart, named the anywheres and the somewheres. The anywheres, as the name implies, could do their work and lead their lives more or less uninterrupted, well, just about anywhere. You could be a graphic designer and have your company and live in Austin or in Berlin or in the Upper West Side or in Paris. Indeed, many of us have seen now during COVID, at least those of us who are fortunate enough to be members of those untethered classes, that without too much interruption, we could pick our lives up from Manhattan, say, and move over to some nice country retreat in upstate New York, or down to Florida, or to relatives in New Jersey, and continue to do the same thing more or less uninterrupted. To the somewheres, this point of view, this emotional valence, is inconceivable. They have been born in Youngstown or San Jose or in Houston. They are there because their families have always been in these cities. They wish to continue and live in these cities because to them, the notion of being rooted in a place, the notion of being rooted in a community that is not interchangeable with other like-minded communities around the world is paramount. What they want to preserve is a sense of rootedness that they feel increasingly is sort of being taken away from them, or being at the very least jeopardized. Now, this explanation is fascinating and valid, but it is more or less the same kind of reasoning that one might have heard under, say, Clinton. It is the explanation that talks about differences in sort of economic mode of production and ways of life. What happens when different kind of professional experiences and realities kind of create divides between different fractions of the population. But I think something major has changed in the last 20 years. And that thing is this. I think in the last 20 years, we have figured out that the differences between the somewheres and the anywheres aren't just socioeconomic, but rather that both these groups have vastly different outlooks. And in the last 10 or so years, as the wealth in this country, or the wealth production in this country among a small portion of the population, has become really unprecedentedly, wildly enormous. I'm talking about the rise of behemoths like Apple and Amazon and Google that now command a literally previously unprecedented foothold on the American and the global economy. The disparities got larger, and the differences between these two outlooks grew as well. Now, to some on the fringes of the anywheres, this worldview manifests itself in trying to replace America's moral founding document, which is the Hebrew Bible, with other ideas pertaining to racial justice, pertaining to racial equality, etc. This is where we get the phenomena that many of us are so intrigued with and sort of kind of alarmed by, that we sometimes call, the radical left, or that, we sometimes refer to as the woke movement. And certainly looking at some of its kind of exaggerations, it is easy to lose sight and believe that these are the real challenges to America right now, and that the radicals, who are, of course, as always, the media darlings, are the ones which we have to fear. But I want to suggest an even grimmer, if I may, point of view, and I do this with a promise that this talk has very much a happy end, which is that the real rift isn't between those on the very fringes who advocate radical and previously inconceivable ideas and notions, but rather with what I would call the non-inflamed majority, who simply have come to adopt a very different worldview than anything that Americans have traditionally considered to be their own. Those people in the anywhere classes, in the professional classes in New York, in LA, in Boston, in Chicago, the people in government and media and academia, believe quite frequently with William James that what works best is most good. This is a vision, as the smart Portuguese writer Bruno Macias said, that imagines America as a giant luxury hotel. We each have our room. We enjoy privacy. We enjoy very high thread count sheets. We enjoy all the amenities that we could possibly want. Whenever we feel so inclined, we could amble over or mosey over to the lobby and meet and see some other people, or spend a few hours drinking at the hotel bar. But what leads our lives is the attempt and the constant striving to get ever better amenities. We want our kids to have better stuff. We want our families to thrive. We want to opt for whatever the form is, or whatever the path is that would get us those things that we most desire. So while the anywheres see America as a Holiday Inn, the somewheres most frequently, and again, we're talking, of course, in generalities, the somewheres see America as a young Israel. They see America not as a hotel, but as a shul, a place that you go to, sometimes happily, if you're a member of the Young Israel of Scarsdale and New Rochelle. Sometimes, if you're not so fortunate and you belong to other shuls, begrudgingly. It's the place where you are bound to run into that nudnik who grabs you by the arm and talks at you, or that yenta who gossips at you behind your back, or that person whose political opinions you absolutely cannot stand. And yet you are together with that person because that is what a community does, because that is how you create a real tightly knit bond between individuals who otherwise would have succumbed to the same temptation and run over to the hotel to seek their own amenities. So here we have a far more complicated explanation of the political landscape in America right now. The anywheres and the somewheres. Those who think of America as a fancy hotel, and those who think of it as a Hamish shul. Some of them belong to this party, some of them belong to that party, but the fault lines, as we increasingly see, are far, far, far from clear cut. Which leaves us with the practical and perhaps terrifying question: who will win? If you are sort of following along at home, it appears as if the anywheres are poised for dramatic victory. They now control tremendous wealth, as I mentioned before. They controlled previously unimaginable platforms that enable absolute reach into the vast majority of American homes. They have control over every cultural, political, intellectual narrative. They seem well on the way to ascertain a vision for the American future that is shaped in their image. However, I want to suggest wildly, and I admit with very few real, concrete, hard pieces of evidence, that they are not winning. Quite the opposite. That the somewheres, that the shul vision of America is the one ascending. The reason why I think is simple. I want to offer two explanations. One is theoretical, hypothetical, and the other is anecdotal and experiential. I think part of the problem that we're seeing right now, and there are plenty of sort of sporadic pieces of evidence to support it, is that this cultural, socioeconomic mode of life that we have gotten accustomed to over the last 15, 20 years is deeply anathema to everything that we understand to be not only American, but indeed human. We are now seeing unprecedented numbers of Americans who, while being better off financially than ever before, having greater access to more and more basic services and goods, are reporting that they feel lonely. We are seeing surging suicide rates. We're seeing social phenomena like unprecedented number of children born out of wedlock, and unprecedented number of women choosing or ending up not married and not starting families at all. We're seeing basic forms of human life and interaction that were virtually unquestionable throughout millennia, like the very basic attachment to another human being for the purpose of starting a family, happening either much later in life or in many cases not at all. This is because these technologies and in many ways these ideologies and the combination between them make it so that more and more and more Americans are lulled into this sense of attaching their lives to these pursuits that turn up to be empty when it's much too late to do anything about it. This was the sort of hypothetical portion. The experiential anecdotal portion has to do with a vibe that I'm seeing all over this country. I spent last year, Sarah Fedminator here knows because she orchestrated much of these travels, spending about 160 days out of the year traveling to various communities and talking to people. And almost in every single one of them, I saw precisely the same thing. I saw groups of people who never before imagined they would be attached to anything remotely religious or Jewish or communal, coming and saying, I crave this. Show me a way to do this. Teach me something. Give me a book to read. Give me a person to meet. Give me something to do, because I increasingly understand that a life spent Netflix and chilling, a life spent binging on TV and working for 20-hour days and getting emails at 11 at night and 6 in the morning and rushing and having no communal support and feeling like you're so alone in this pursuit, that is not the life that I want. And it appears to me that there were people long ago, some of them my direct ancestors, who had much better answers teach me. And so I deeply believe that out of our contemporary morass of misery, we will yet see, and soon, a sort of great awakening that will be truly one of the greatest moments in the history of this country. And if you want to know what it would look like, here I have a relatively simple and easy to understand answer. It will look like a return to fundamental American values. We saw this in play this past Thanksgiving Eve, when at the stroke of midnight, like a good Frank Capra Hollywood film, a coalition of unlikely partners, Orthodox Jews, conservative Catholics, with an assist from traditionalist Muslims, got together to say that all science and public health considerations aside, government should not have the power to prioritize opening businesses over houses of worship. And that argument that thankfully ended up being ascendant in the Supreme Court was not a particularly Jewish argument, although of course it was. It was not a particularly parochial argument. It was rooted in the very heart of America's Constitution and its guarantees for our most basic liberties. And it brought together these two coalitions who understood, perhaps for the first time, that what they share isn't just some marriage of convenience, but rather a real and true affinity to ideas and values. And so with that, I think that gives us a tremendous sign of hope for the future. I think it's not unfair to say that American Jews have spent the last 8 or 9 or even in some cases 10 decades learning how to be Americans. The great stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that we read in Bernard Malamud and Sol Bellow and Philip Roth, are stories of Jews learning to become American. And I think the next 3 or 4 or 5 decades will be about the exact opposite. They'll be about Americans learning again how to be Jews, learning again to connect with this tradition, with these values, with these ideas, with this tremendous wealth of spiritual wisdom, not to mention practice, that many of them sort of left aside, thinking it was no longer relevant in modernity. And here's the even better news. As they do it, and the ways that they will choose to do it will be so incredibly diverse, some by practice, some by writing and thought, some in small chavrutas, some in big, beautiful communities that will yet be resurgent. But the important part, I think, is this: as they do it, as they return to these traditions, they will realize that they're far from alone. They would realize that there are 2nd and 3rd and 4th generation Muslim Americans who are living through the exact same narrative, that there are conservative Catholics and traditionalist Catholics who are grappling with the same issues, that there are 1st and 2nd generation Indian immigrants in this country are sons of immigrants and daughters of immigrants who are grappling with the same problems and all arrive at the same conclusions, all arrive at the understanding that the purpose of America was never to steamroll over all of our differences and create some kind of uniform creature that worships at the altar of some other ephemeral and ethereal form of good, but rather a beautiful mosaic that is universalist precisely because it is made up of 100, 1,000, a million little particulars that adhere to their faith and to their tradition. I think we're seeing this already. I think we're seeing this in the immense rise of so many forms of Jewish life. The fact that there are 90 of us tonight here on a Zoom call, the most kind of, weirdly impersonal form of inhuman communication, just because we want to talk about these questions, just because we care enough, tells you everything that you need to know, that the passion and the spirit is there. Some institutions will survive and lead us in this change. Some new institutions will arise and facilitate. The most important thing, I think, is that we are looking at a kind of realignment that puts us squarely, perhaps for the first time, in some kind of something approaching an American majority, that puts aside the tiresome, exhausting, and largely meaningless quibbles that we define today as political, and that allow us to focus on the things, on the values, on the texts, on the beliefs, on the ideas that have always sustained us as a people. And I think now is a very good time for me to stop listening to the sound of my own voice and hopefully turn this into a conversation.
So first of all, thank you, Liel, for uplifting talk. I want to invite everybody now in the chat box. You can send if you have any questions for Liel, follow-up questions from his presentation, you can put them in the chat box. I'll open with one while people gather their thoughts and get them into words. And it just, you spoke about the sort of that emerging Jewish spirit that is present. It's already a little bit present, and it's going to become even more so in the years ahead. How does that Jewish spirit right now overcome some of the challenges we're seeing with the rise in incidents of anti-Semitism? What kind of perspective do you feel like? How does that Jewish spirit fend off and fight off that anti-Semitism?
I think it's an amazing question. I want to begin by citing one of our wisest, fiercest, and bravest, public figures. Someone who you've had the very good fortune and insight to invite as your second speaker in the series, and someone who I'm very proud to call one of my closest friends, Barry Weiss, who was bat mitzvahed in the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And after the massacre there, said in private, and I believe in public too, that she feels like she had just woken up from a vacation from history, which I found to be so profoundly moving, because I understood, even though I was not born in this country, I was born in Israel and lived there for the first 23 years of my life, and certainly its own different reality with its own different set of challenges. But I've been here long enough to know that for many of us, I think the sense of life pre-Pittsburgh, pre the rise in anti-Semitism, pre the kind of feeling that there is now persecution and bigotry from left and right, felt a little bit like that proverbial vacation, right? You lived in a place where it was just assumed that you were going to be safe. And if some older, crotchety person shook their finger at you and said, but anti-Semitism will return, it always does, we've seen it before, you were excused, if you're a person my age or younger, saying like, thank you, I appreciate it, you're wrong, we young know better. And what that kind of shaking up did, I think, is force a lot of people, a lot of American Jews, to take a good hard look at what being Jewish actually meant, which is a very complicated question, because I think for many of us, especially those of us who are not observant, who are not members of shuls or communities, who do not live lives that are tethered to or plugged into a lot of the traditional institutions of Jewish life. This really meant, or being Jewish really meant, some kind of, floating identity modifier that could be turned on or off at will, like a party trick. And I think Pittsburgh and the current rise in anti-Semitism ended all that. And I think as people started scrambling and trying to answer, okay, what now? I think we all arrived at a eerily similar answer. And the answer is this: there is no one way. There is no one path. Just as there are 70 faces to the Torah, there are 1,000 paths into Judaism. The only two things that you must never ever do, and there are only two, is one, let the haters define who you are, and B, do nothing. As long as you engage with this question of what does your Jewish identity look like to you, and as long as you do it in some kind of proactive way, and it could be listening to the wisdom of Rabbi Morgenstern on his own podcast or in mine. It could be joining a Talmud study group. It could be picking up a great Amos Oz novel. It could be literally anything that challenges you to stop and think about these things. You are taking a very important step on a very profound, meaningful, life-changing journey. And look, I know from my own experiences, if we spoke 6 or 7 years ago, I would not be covering my head. I would not be keeping kosher or davening 3 times a day or studying. And I am not saying that this is the only sort of pre-approved path to enlightenment, but I'm saying that once you start asking these questions and you ask them honestly and openly, you never know how your life is going to transform. And I'm seeing so many people ask them openly and honestly, and it just warms my heart.
Thank you. We got a few questions here, actually a number of questions. I don't know if we're gonna have time to get to all of them, but we'll ask just a few of them. Someone asked, how is the emerging Jewish spirit playing out currently in Europe?
I think that is a bit of a grim answer. I started my morning today with a conversation with a lovely gentleman by the name of Philippe Etienne. He is the French ambassador to the United States. I had many questions for him, including, where do you get your baguettes and croissants? Do you go to like Panera or McDonald's? And he looked at me and said, but of course we have our own baker, as if kind of savage even asks the question. But on a more serious note, we also talked about the fact that France has currently more than 2/3 of all hate crimes in that country are directed at its Jewish population, which is the world's 3rd largest Jewish population. And that number has increased by nearly 30% since 2018. I am not that much of an expert on Europe, but if you're asking me for my gut feeling, I believe that unlike here, a nation that has always had its own a geographic, historic, theological barriers and insulations from these kinds of inflammations that we see in Europe. I actually think that the European project is pretty grim. I think that what we're seeing now, not to get too world historical in Europe, is a sort of conclusion of a process that began in the 1910s. I think many of their insistences on the kind of traditionalist land-bound, tradition-bound nation states are coming under tremendous attack. I think the nations that are preserving it most assiduously, I'm talking Hungary, I'm talking Poland, are nations that I think have a better chance emerging relatively unscathed. I do not see how France, Germany, and to an extent England are going to emerge from the tribulations of the next couple of years. But again, Europe has thankfully never been, too high on my radar. And I think that as you see more and more Jewish communities emigrate either to Israel or to the United States from Europe, I think you understand that their feeling of confidence is similarly very low.
I'm going to turn it over for our last question of the night. I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Morgenstern.
Liel. Okay, it was great to hear you, to see you and hear you. So I just want to ask the question. You wrote an article called Get Out, where you basically said, like, enough's enough. They don't want us in our, in their institutions of higher learning, and the universities and so on and so forth. And we should stop, trying to push ourselves, into that. My question to you is, do you really mean that? If yes, alternatives, I guess, right? Yeshiva University, Turo. If not, what were you meaning to inspire in that piece?
So it is. Thank you for this this provocative question. It is the very wild privilege of people who make their living writing sort of big inflammatory pieces to sometimes write things just merely by way of provocation. But I assure you that when I wrote the piece that insisted that American Jews should no longer send their children to colleges, let alone financial support any institutions of higher learning, I was being 100% earnest and serious. I came to this country as an immigrant from Israel in October of 1999. I had about $1,000 in my pocket that I had saved as working as a guard, a night watchman at a factory in Herzliya. And I didn't particularly care, even though a taxi took me for a wild ride on the first night of my arrival and charged about $300 for the ride from the airport, because I had a very good plan. And in my mind, the plan was foolproof. And I started implementing it the very next morning. I landed on Thursday night, and Friday morning, I took the train into the city. I was staying with a friend in Westchester. And then I took the subway over to 116th and Broadway, and I descended on Columbia University. And like so many young and impoverished immigrants before me, I promised myself that before too long, I will be admitted to this institution, and this institution, being the true kind of crucible of meritocracy, will allow me the chance to make something of myself and work my way into the upper echelons where I so clearly belong. And I'm very happy to report that for a decade or so, everything went according to plan. I was admitted shortly thereafter. I got my master's, and then another master's, and then a PhD, and then taught Columbia, and then moved to NYU. And for a very long time was relatively happy until something rather strange started happening, which is I started noticing that slowly, as they say, it's like, how do you go bankrupt? First gradually, and then all of a sudden. So first gradually, and then all of a sudden, I started noticing that my colleagues were practicing something that was deeply unfamiliar to me as a form of intellectual pursuit. That they were committing themselves to preconceived notions, that they were closing themselves off from certain avenues of debate. I'll give just one completely banal but deeply instructive, example. I heard that one of my colleagues was holding a seminar about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I wrote to her and said that as someone who served in the Israeli army and was involved in a number of Israeli-Palestinian coexistence dialogue groups, I certainly have something to say about this, much more than some of my colleagues who have never been to the region yet feel, deeply impassioned and entitled to their opinions. And I received a note back that said, "Sorry, this is a closed group." And I said, wait a minute, wasn't the whole idea of university to be a place where the free and unfettered exchange of ideas could happen between people in the spirit of camaraderie and open discussion? And I got a wall of silence in return. And worse than that, I got what was increasingly obvious and evident to be a kind of rejection, because it was obvious and evident that the institution
and my colleagues were interested in sanctifying their preconceived notions and using their academic tenure as a cudgel to continue and train generations of people who believe precisely the same thing. And now it doesn't matter what it is that you believe, even if I believe the same thing, that struck me as so deeply, at odds with everything I believed higher education to be, that I myself left. And as I left, I started seeing the same kind of inflammation that had curtailed my academic career take over more and more and more and more and more institutions in ways that were increasingly more and more and more and more wild and difficult to imagine. And then I started thinking, is there any way to change that? If you're interested, you could read the article. My answer is resoundingly no. In part because American universities have become huge businesses that now, like an Arby's or Wendy's, put out franchises. There's NYU Shanghai, there's NYU Abu Dhabi. Like, you could go to these places and learn, have the same experience wherever you are, because it's like the drive-through version, right, of the education. In part because the tenure system makes any kind of resistance very, very hard. In part because a whole host of other factors, some socioeconomic, some structural, some political. I believe that current institution, and again, I say this with tremendous pain as someone who's dedicated 20 years of his life to this pursuit, I believe it is unsalvageable. I believe it is beyond redemption. Now, what does that practically mean? What do I mean when I say to people, don't send your sons and daughters to college? What do I expect them to do in return? First of all, I expect them to remember that what made Jews great, in fact, what made the ascent of American Jews possible at all, was a commitment not to some false idea of equity, but to excellence, but to the understanding that our commitment is always to thinking our way through very difficult situations and coming up with the best methods, with the best ideas, with the best attempts at grappling with truth. That pursuit continues. If it happens in an ivy covered building with a storied tradition, or if it happens in Yeshiva University, the Hogwarts of the Jewish people, or if it happens in some small group or Bet Midrash, or if it happens online, or if it happens just between individuals who are eager to discover themselves, it will happen nonetheless. I think you hear my dog happily agreeing with me. I think what particular form it will take remains to be seen. I think that there are a lot of really, really exciting ways that we haven't even begun playing with. One example that I love to give is something that we could learn from our Haredi brothers and sisters, the idea of the kollel, the idea that a community may say, because we value education so much, we will now pool our resources and make it so that our best and our brightest, rather than paying $250,000 for a piece of paper that increasingly is worthless, we will pay these people to come and study for study's sake, so that they may be truly excellent. And by the way, as part of their commitments, they will then take it upon themselves to teach other members of the community. So if an accountant or a lawyer or a nurse or a doctor wants to swing by at 7 p.m. and study a little bit of philosophy or a little bit of Talmud or a little bit of literature or a little bit of science, they may do so at a place that is truly rooted in community. To me, the future is much less about, again, this America as a fancy hotel vision of the anywheres, much less about go to Harvard, you're, fast track to success, you join this class of meritocrats, and then you could go to, Brazil or France or wherever you want and live the lifestyle that you always dreamed about. It's much more about being rooted in a particular community with a particular values. And if small communities pull the resources together and create these kinds of institutions that identify and reward their best and brightest, we would be much better for it. You could already see some of this happening in programs like, for example, some of the stuff that Tikva is putting out. You could already see it in the kind of impromptu gatherings that some Jewish communities have and facilitate. But I think it would have tremendous impact if, and only if, we have the courage to stop telling our children what we currently tell them, which is take this $250,000, go to a place where you will learn very little and be abused simply for who you are, just because that piece of paper that says Princeton or Harvard or Yale in it is worth something to us. It's worthless to us. It's knowledge that we seek. It will always be thus. And thank God we have come up throughout the ages with pretty creative ways to seek it and attain it.
All right, thank you, Liel. I want to thank Living Torah Fund and Sarah Ader, Ari Kepitz, and Steve Smith, who have been working on ideas for how to make our Living Torah Fund programming in the coming year amazing and excellent, like tonight's program with Liel Leibovitz. Join us next Wednesday evening at 8 o'clock. We will be hosting a Barry Weiss in this very same Zoom room, and looking forward to that program as well. He is Liel Leibovitz, senior writer, Tablet Magazine, host of the podcast Unorthodox. Thank you so much, Liel, for being with us. Thank you all for joining us. I wish everybody a great night.
Freilich Chanukah, everyone.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.